If there have been any assumptions about fertility between denominations of Christianity, the one that used to be common knowledge was that Catholics have bigger families than Protestants. That was not just an assumption, though. In the past, statistical data shows that it was true. A chart from U.S. Vital Statistics during the years of 1951 through 1975 shows that Catholics' total fertility rate was higher than Protestants. In the period of time from 1961 through 1965, the average Catholic family would have 4.25 children, while the average Protestant family had only 3.14. But as the years have passed, the difference has become substantially smaller. Two factors that must be considered when looking at birth rates of those with different denominational affiliation or any other differences are, firstly, that birth rates are declining across the board in the United States. The Pew Research Center shows a decline by half in the American birth rate since a peak in the 1960s up to 2018. Secondly, Americans have a higher birth rate than the other developed countries. In the journal article, Are the Faithful Becoming Less Fruitful?, Samuel L. Perry and Cyrus Schlafer write, Americans have long experienced higher rates of fertility compared to other developed nations, at least in part because they tend to be relatively more religious than citizens of other nations. Another difference of note is the number of children between the more theologically liberal mainline Protestants and the theologically conservative evangelical Protestants. The Pew Research Center's 2014 Religious Landscape Study did find a difference here. Evangelical Protestants and Catholics were tied with 2.3 children each, but mainline Protestants were down at 1.9 children. Those part of historically black Protestant denominations had 2.5 children on average. Unfortunately, I can find no evidence of a poll with a large enough sample size that they could break down fertility rates in the U.S. by specific denominations, only these more general categories. However, we can look at a few other factors to get some idea. For example, there are age statistics about these denominations. Let's take a look. Pew Research Center's article on which U.S. religious groups are oldest and youngest contains a chart from the 2014 U.S. Religious Landscape Study that shows some definite trends. The youngest age group in the study is the 18 through 29 age group. We'd expect groups with a higher birth rate to have more people in this age group, and the groups with the smallest size of this group are the Presbyterian Church USA, Anglican Church, United Methodist Church, and Episcopal Church. These are mainline churches or theologically liberal. However, this data can't be trusted to really be giving us accurate information about birth rates. By the time a person is in the 18 through 29 age category, they have had time to switch their denomination, and there's pretty good evidence to show that that is what is happening here. Atheists and agnostics have some of the highest shares of the 18 through 29 category, but the Pew Research Center shows that they have some of the lowest birth rates, which indicates that the ranks of young atheists and agnostics are not being filled by them being born into atheist and agnostic families, but rather they are becoming atheist and agnostic in their teens and 20s. And they were actually born into families that were religious. Attitudes of denominations toward birth control and abortion could also play a part in how many children we might expect them to have. As for abortion, once again, theologically liberal mainline denominations top the charts, with the Episcopal Church and United Church of Christ both having a greater than 70% share that believe abortion should be legal. Pentecostal groups like the Assemblies of God and Church of God Cleveland, Tennessee, and also Southern Baptist and Church of Christ members are majority opposed to the legality of abortion. The concept of birth control is mostly not a controversial issue in America, although certain methods may be rejected by some. Less than 10% of all denominational categories believe it is morally wrong. 8% of Catholics, 6% of black Protestants, and 3% of white evangelicals, and only 1% of white mainline believe that way. Of course, certain smaller groups like the Amish are the outliers. There's virtually no practice of birth control, and in the first 5 years of the 2010s, the Amish population increased by 18%. Let me say that again. In 5 years, the Amish population increased by 18%. That means they're doubling every 22 years. In 1992, there were 124,000 Amish, and in 2016, that number was 308,000. One problem with considering the denominational affiliation of an individual and then evaluating anything, such as fertility rate, is that people nowadays will often attend church little or never, but still claim to be adherents of a certain group. Meanwhile, though their behavior may be very different from those who attend services more frequently and are more in tune to the doctrine of their churches, their responses to polls can affect the data significantly. So to isolate for this, we can look at fertility rates of people based on their own responses as to how often they attend church and how religious they are. A chart from the report Religion, Religiousness, and Fertility in the U.S. and in Europe, published by the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research, shows that in 2006, U.S. Catholics that never attend services had a mean birth rate of 1.26. This increases to 1.59 for those who attend 1 to 3 times a month, and once a week attenders were at 1.76, and for more than once a week the number was 1.78. The fertility numbers also increase for Protestants. When women are asked how important religion is in their daily life, those who said not important had 50% fewer children than those who said that religion was very important. Based on the evidence from this research, this report also stated the following. In the U.S., the more liberal denominations such as Presbyterians, Methodists, Lutherans, and Episcopalians have lower fertility than Catholics and fundamentalist Protestants. An article from the National Institute of Health outlining research in this area said in part, as the denominational differences diminished, researchers shifted attention to religious involvement. Several studies in Western settings have shown that regardless of denominational affiliation, more religious people usually have higher fertility and lower contraceptive use or tend to favor formal marriage over cohabitation, which in turn leads to higher fertility. One additional note on the matter is that there are certain groups of people that stretch across many denominations or are not part of any denomination that hold to a theology often referred to as Quiverfull. Those who believe in this often try to have many children and may have anti-contraception beliefs. However, because the number of these people is not that high, and because they are spread out across the Christian denominational spectrum, they don't tend to make any one group stick out significantly, though they may play a part in pushing the evangelical numbers up a bit higher. Peter Jenkins suggested a possible alternative understanding of the connection between religious adherence and fertility in the article Fertility, Faith, and Secular America, where he said, we might suggest that fertility declines first, and this decline affects religiosity. Smaller families reduce their ties to organized religious institutions as there are simply fewer children to put through religious school and First Communion classes or the equivalent training and socialization in other religions. As religious ties diminish, ordinary people increasingly define their values in individualistic and secular terms and are more willing to oppose churches or religious institutions on social and political issues of gender and morality. In part, this opposition results from the growing separation between sexuality and reproduction. And of course, statistics don't always tell an individual story. As Julie Zausmer wrote in the Washington Post for the article Stop Assuming That Families with Lots of Children Are Religious, in today's America, the only religious group that is far more likely to have large families is Mormons. Members of some religious groups are a little bit more likely to have at least 4 children. 17% of evangelical Protestants had at least 4 kids, and 18% of Catholics. Some are a little bit less likely. 9% of mainline Protestants had at least 4 children, and 12% of Jews. The Mormons are by far the outlier. 46% of Mormon adults have had at least 4 children. So how do the non-religious stack up compared to religious people? Not so differently. 12% of nuns, the rapidly growing group of Americans who identify their religion as nothing in particular, have had at least 4 children. As younger adults elect nun as their religious preference more and more often, the number of large nun families in the country may well rise.